Okay, security risks, terrorism, and the impact it has on and the relationship it has to international business. And you have a kind of broad article by several authors from 2010, Terrorism and International Business, which reviews, the research which had been conducted before they wrote the article, research on international terrorism or terrorism and international business. And they look at the impact, the trends, what is new, what is old in this phenomenon. And they argue, in terms of changes and trends, that there are really three broad trends that have changed some of the nature of terrorism. First is globalization. The globalization phenomenon, the interconnectedness of different parts of the world, and not least as it relates to the information revolution, which has made it possible for people, for groups to decentralize. What I spoke briefly about in the first part, the decentralization of some of these transnational groups in particular, or global groups. They can communicate with each other. I mean, the internet and the information revolution can broadly be said to be a really good thing, but you often have these drawbacks, these negative things, and the communication and the inspiration, the possibilities for communication and inspiration of other people far away often, other terrorists far away. Or prospective terrorists. And we know that from the recruitment strategy, for instance, by the Islamic State. Excellent recruitment strategy from their perspective. Flashy magazines and skilled use of social media to create a story, a narrative, that this is, the future. The caliphate is the future. Join our group. And a lot of people from almost all around the world and all around Europe joined the group. And the Islamic State also succeeded in inspiring followers to institute attacks. And this wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for some of these traits and trends and interconnectedness and information revolution. A second trend, broad trend, is the religious fundamentalism, jihadism or militant Islam. Islamism is political Islam, so it has nothing, at base to do with terrorism. So we can use the concept of jihadism or militant Islam, which you had far less of back in the 70s, where you had a lot of terrorist attacks, by the way, ideologically motivated. You had even animal welfare related terrorist attacks. They also have a political goal. They're non-state groups. They used violence, some of these groups back in the 70s and 80s. Ideology, and you had the ethnic-based groups and you had groups fighting for independence. And then you had certain things happening around 1979. You had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was a fundamental happening also in this terrorism context, because a lot of these jihadists received their training and fighting experience in the battle for control over Afghanistan, or the battle to get the Soviets to leave. And the Russians or Soviets eventually left as the Cold War drew to an end. But they were really outfought gradually by often the foreign fighters coming into Afghanistan. The second big development in 1979 was the Iranian Revolution, which also changed parts of the game when it comes to religion, when it comes to sectarianism, the schism sometimes found within Islam, between Shias mostly and Sunnis. And Iran is a Shia-dominated country. These big global groups, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, they adhere to the Sunni Muslim tradition. And some of these things, spurred new groups, and in particular, and then you had these things happening in 2001, and that was an Al-Qaeda planned, executed attack in the United States, in Washington, in New York, sorry, and against the Pentagon. And then you changed, and this says something about the effects these terrorist attacks may have if they succeed, because in this instance they changed, fundamentally the direction of U.S. foreign policy. So now the U.S. in September 2001, they become much more activist, international. Okay, first you secure a change of regime in Afghanistan, and then you had, mostly actually by the assistance of local forces and fighters, and then you intensify the operations in Afghanistan, and you get a long-running war, which isn't over, and Afghanistan isn't, stabilized, and the future of Afghanistan is still uncertain. The Americans are still there after all these years, with currently some 6,000, 7,000 soldiers. But then in 2003 they attacked Iraq, which was in most respects a major mistake. So the US attacks Iraq, and you create a vacuum of governance. And Iraq essentially becomes a failed state with low degree of central control. And the Iraqi state, disintegrates, and you get these groups fear each other. The Sunnis in Iraq, which used to govern when Saddam Hussein was in charge, they don't have political power. The majority are the Shia, or the largest ethnic group are the Shia. So they pretty much control Iraq from, almost from that moment the Americans have control over Iraq. And the Sunnis are fighting back, or many Sunnis are fighting back. And they're excluded from power, excluded from their old privileges, and they take to their guns. That's also the story, the background story for the growth of the Islamic State, which used to be called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So that was the Iraqi branch of Al-Qaeda. And they're fighting for a fundamental, version of Islam, back to, the 7th century. Back to the old ways. And that's religious fundamentalism, which has become quite widespread. And these global groups, Al-Qaeda, and in particular now in recent years the Islamic State, even though they're militarily defeated in Iraq, in Syria, these core areas, they have managed to spread their thinking and their ideology. And you have cells, around in South Asia, in Southeast Asia. You have it in the Sahel belt, as I briefly spoke about. You even have it in Democratic Republic of the Congo, and you have it in Mozambique. And so the problem has not disappeared. It's just, become, the geography has changed somewhat. A third trend which the authors worry about concerns the weapons of mass destruction, which is a concept that normally includes nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, these horrible weapons. Nuclear weapons, those are really in a class of their own in terms of destructive power. and it's really hard for a terrorist group. It's virtually impossible to get hold of, a nuclear bomb. You can have so-called dirty bombs, which kind of approximate some of the qualities of a real nuclear bomb, but it's still a difficult project. But some of these groups, they want to have these big attacks. Many people killed, a lot of news coverage, a lot of fear created. And of course, biological weapons, chemical weapons are more easily attainable. So that has been a worry. It hasn't been a major problem if you look at the empirics from since this article was written. Weapons of mass destruction has been an ambition for many groups, or some groups at least. It's been an ambition, but mostly an unrealized ambition, because it's not necessarily that easy to construct a viable biological device that can spread diseases in a terrorist attack, or chemical weapons. It's also real effective chemical weapons are hard to construct by these groups. But the risk, the impact of, if you take that point of angle, you have, probability times impact is a low probability thing, but a really, really high impact if a terrorist group succeeds in using some of these such weapons in a crowded area in a city. So, special aspects of terrorism, some of these dimensions. What is it with terrorism? What are the consequences? What are the general objectives? The ultimate political objectives vary. Some groups want a caliphate, and some groups want, the regime to collapse. Some groups want independence for their people, ethnic group. But the basic thing and the general thing is that they seek societal changes, which is part of the political phenomenon. Who has power over society, over the state, by using violence, and that's really some of the key definitions. Also, almost by definition, they're unconstrained by rules and norms. They can't use violence. In a normally functioning state, the government has a monopoly on violence. You have the police, you have the military. Ordinary people can't use violence. Groups can't use violence. So automatically you break the rules and norms and regulations of a society if your group turns to arms and blows things up or attacks people, kidnap people. And often these rules and norms are, for some of these groups, are not seen as legitimate. That's typical for many jihadist groups, that the order of the state or the region or the world order for that matter is illegitimate. The religion, Islam, the Quran should govern. Thirdly, you have maximization of psychological influence, and that's really the thing about the attack itself is often horrible, in particular for the people involved in it and attacked. But the psychological influence is often so much greater, and I'll return to some of these things when we discuss the luxury hotel attacks. One successful attack, creates havoc for society in the minds of people. You get scared. All the news channels are running this story, and people get even more scared often because there is so much news coverage. So you had, for instance, people often refer to, and Barack Obama, previous president of the United States, in one speech, he tried to put some perspective on the terrorism problem in the United States, saying that, you know, more people die in bathroom accidents than from terrorist attacks in the US in a typical year, which is totally true. The exception was probably 9/11. But it doesn't matter, because bathroom accidents don't have this major society, broad psychological influence that terrorism has. So terrorism can, you know, be useful if you want to polarize societies, if you want to create that fear, if you want, you know, the regime to be shaken, if you want investors to stay out. So some people say, okay, it's and maybe I now jump to this citation. Typically, terrorism does not achieve its intended strategic objectives. It's hard to measure, actually, and it's often a slow process, and it's hard to say often what is the strategic objective. Is the Islamic State a failure, for instance, for not managing to uphold their so-called caliphate in Syria and Iraq? Or is it a success for actually having controlled territory, a big chunk of territory, for such a long time, relatively speaking? And is it a success, the Islamic State, for having managed to spread and survive in different geographical areas? Is this a slow battle from the perspective of the people in the Islamic State? So you can deem, you know, the Islamic State a failure on the one hand. You know, this paradise on earth, this caliphate didn't survive given the military pressure. Is it a failure or is it a success? Because we still have that group in some areas. They're really they control territory, actually, in parts of the Sahel belt in Africa, and the group is not dead by any means. Okay, the last point here was civilians as targets, because that's something that has changed quite dramatically for the last couple of decades, and perhaps symbolized most vividly in 1998. The Al-Qaeda was a known entity at the time, but they became even more known after the attacks against US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, simultaneous attacks. And that came, of course, 3 years before the spectacular 9/11 attacks. And civilians are targets. 3,000 people, civilians, died in the attacks against the US. Many hundreds in these embassy attacks. And if you go back to the 70s, if you go back to the 80s, often physical assets. Not often people, not often civilian targets. And groups wanted, you know, recognition, and they wanted news coverage, but they didn't, in general, most groups, by far the majority, didn't in general seek a lot of deaths. And that seems to be, you know, part of the modus operandi of these, many of these jihadist groups. Of course, some of the psychological effects which impact society and the economy of deeply affected countries, some of these things have to do with the unpredictability of terrorism. You don't know, and if you go back to 2016, 17, again in Europe, you get this sense that, you know, you question, when is the next attack coming? Because we've had so many. And we don't know, will it be in Paris, in Nice? Is it safe to go abroad? Is it safe? Many people stayed away from France, actually, for a fairly long period of time. They stayed away from Turkey. Turkey had a lot of attacks for a you know, brief, but not too brief period. And it's the unpredictability and the uncertainties and the fear and the psychological influence, to really sum it up, that forms some of the core of the problem, and some of the core objectives of these groups. So some of these new trends, the new terrorism, so-called increased mortality, clearly. So terrorism suddenly becomes or not suddenly, but gradually becomes a problem for ordinary civilians, and that forms part of, the drama, or the sorrow and the fear, because this happens to ordinary people, not only, businesses, or not only government leaders. If you go back to the late 1800s, a lot of state leaders were murdered by anarchists, terrorist groups, with radical motivation, but they didn't target civilians. And in the 70s, 80s, normally these groups didn't target civilians. The Spanish group, or Basque group, ETA, or the IRA, or Baader Meinhof in Germany, or Red Brigade in Italy. They didn't normally target civilians. They had more specific goals. They wanted news coverage, they wanted to fulfill their aims, but not by killing civilians. Suicide attacks, relatively, it's not a new phenomenon, but the spread and the use of suicide bombers have grown alongside jihadist attacks. But also in Sri Lanka, for instance, during the long, gruesome civil war, there were a lot of suicide attacks instituted by the Tamil Tigers against the government. Religiously inspired terrorism, as I've spoken about, you have more prevalent attacks, as the trend lines show, but you have had a drop in recent years, but from a really severe spike a few years ago. A lot of attacks against soft targets, and often one prefers, as a terrorist, and jihadist groups prefer often soft targets, not these hardened targets, simply because, well, the basic motivation or reasoning is often simply that they're so hard to get at. A military base, successful attack against a military base, really hard. Airports, airlines, actually, with the increased focus on that problem since 9/11, it has become much more difficult to successfully execute attacks against the airline industry or airports. Even though you have had exceptions, you had it 3 or 4 years ago in Belgium, against the airport there during Easter time. You had a similar attack in Istanbul, in Turkey, around that same time period. But in general, these airports are harder targets nowadays. And luxury hotels, which I will get back to pretty soon, are often this representative of the class of soft terrorist targets. A lot of news coverage if you're successful, and often not too difficult to execute such an attack. Government leaders, state leaders, it's much more difficult now actually to target them. They're so protected. You have all this security, and what used to be a major problem in for instance in Europe over 100 years ago, a lot of state leaders and kings and were assassinated. It's not a major problem now. The soft targets are worse in that respect. The Middle East and South Asia have seen a vast increase of terrorist attacks over the last 2 or 3 decades. And it really, as I referred to earlier, began we can say, 1979 is the symbolic year, mostly for the reason of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Christmas 1979, and the fighting against the Soviet, who were deemed occupiers of Afghanistan. You also have more transnational networks working across borders, planning attacks in one place and executing it in another. And of course, Al Qaeda and Islamic State are the two most prominent exponents of such groups. High-profile attacks, another such dimension. It used to be the case in earlier times as well. One should point out that the high-profile attacks are sought. High-profile victims are sought. Symbolic victims are sought. It's not necessarily a coincidence that the World Trade Center in New York were targeted and were on top of the list of potential targets for Al Qaeda back in 2001, along with the Pentagon. Symbolic target, the defense department of the U.S. And one speculates that the fourth plane, which didn't reach its target, it was supposed to hit the Congress, another political symbol. So you had a military symbol, the Pentagon, you had the economic symbol, the World Trade Center in New York, and you had the Congress, which is really the political symbol along with the White House. And then lastly, you have cyber terrorism, which is a totally new, in historical context, totally new form of terrorism. And sometimes you have political goals. Often these are state actors or they're criminals, hence they fall outside this definition of terrorism. But you also have highly skilled groups, highly skilled in this new technology. So these are recent trends in the terrorism problem. Okay, so you have different forms of effect. You have direct effects. You can separate between direct effects and indirect effects. The direct effects on international business, or IB, are kind of clear cut. If terrorists attacks a company, which they do sometimes. In Libya recently, you attacked. They have occupied the eastern rebels in Libya, and the Libyan civil war have effectively occupied the oil installations of most of the country. Most of the oil in Libya is in the eastern part. As we'll get back to, Statoil was attacked and British Petroleum was attacked in Algeria. A few days ago you had a pipeline explosion you have this big pipeline, natural gas pipeline, running through several Middle Eastern states, and the Islamic State supposedly blew up in a big explosion this pipeline. You damage infrastructure. That's quite common, for instance, in Colombia. These left-wing groups, ELN and FARC, which has formally given up its struggle. The ELN, the other big group, fights on and blows up pipeline to hurt Colombian state regime, multinational businesses. They want multinationals out and oil companies, Western oil companies, out of Colombia. So, of course, these are examples of direct damage. And employees, and this is kind of sad story for many individuals, because many employees are kidnapped in difficult areas. Nigeria, for instance, is rife with kidnapping still, and you have huge security. If you work in the oil business, for instance, in Nigeria, you're a Western employee, there's a high risk of being kidnapped. Hence, the company has to make sure that the risk, is lowered. And sometimes you have terrorists with political goals, sometimes you have criminals. Employees of Western companies are money. Their profit. You kidnap, you hold, and you seek a ransom. $1 million, $2 million. And these groups around the world, Colombia, I briefly mentioned that, kidnapping has been a way of financing these left-wing groups, FARC and the ELN. They have made a lot of money on kidnapping people, and often employees of these mining companies, Western mining companies, or oil companies. So these are the direct effects from terrorism, which Statoil experienced to a horrible degree back in 2013. The indirect effects are, of course, often less visible, often less easy to specify. But the authors go on and argue that, you know, one of these effects, in particular connected to big terrorist attacks, is a reduction in demand from consumers, because, you know, the future feels more insecure. Your confidence, the confidence level of the society drops. One tends to buy less. You could see that, of course, 9/11. You have it has a huge impact on consumer demand. You have increased transaction or friction cost, regulations, and it's more difficult to conduct business. You have more demands from the government that, you know, if you sail your goods to a port, you know, the containers have to go through security. Security is significantly beefed up. We know that from air travel after 9/11, that, you know, you get all these hassles. And the sum of it for businesses, international businesses, is quite significant. It's more costly. These are indirect effects from terrorist attacks. Severing of distribution chains, that can happen. I mean, multinationals are located in different parts of the world, and you base your production on getting inputs from different subsidiaries. And we know that from similar non-terrorist related events like the coronavirus situation, which is difficult for the distribution chain of these multinationals. The trade war, you know, so-called, between the US and China, it has a huge impact on, you know, the issue of whether or not a company, a Chinese company, for instance, can source their inputs from American firms. And big terrorist attacks and big terrorism problems have some of these same effects. General reduction of foreign direct investment is also associated with terrorism problem. Empirical research shows that. And in general, you have increased pressure on the company to institute security management procedures. Can be costly, that as well. Insurance costs rise. You can get terrorism insurance if you go to, you know, you can get that in Europe as well. You can certainly, I mean, if you go to more difficult business environments, more security risky environments, it's quite common to get insurance. Insurance premiums rise when the terrorism problem grows. So I will take a short break, I think, and then we'll jump into the issue of the case of luxury hotels, terrorism, and the hotel sector.